religious violence is nothing new or unique. We've been killing each other in the name of religion throughout human history. Most religious traditions have produced extremist movements whose members believe their faith and value system is superior to others. This concept of the one true faith has been used by many fundamentalists to justify violent intolerance on behalf of their religion. The Bible discusses many religious assassinations, wars, and even genocide in defense of the faith. Within Judaism, the Old Testament is replete with references to the ancient Hebrews' faith-based mandate to wage war against non-Jewish occupiers of the Promised Land. Within Christianity, the medieval Crusades were a series of exceptionally violent military campaigns against Muslims, Jews, and heretical Christian sects. Later, during the 16th and 17th centuries, Catholic and Protestant Christians waged relentless wars against each other, which were marked by extreme brutality. In terms of Islam, relative religious tolerance of the 15th and 16th centuries is counterbalanced against modern intolerance among movements such as Afghanistan's Taliban, Palestine's Hamas, and Lebanon's Hezbollah. Religious terrorists are modern manifestations of historical traditions of extremism within the world's major faiths. Each major religion in the U.S. has seen extremists committing violent acts in the religion's name. For example, members of the Jewish Defense League have previously been arrested for conspiring to bomb Muslim mosques in the offices of a U.S. congressperson. Christian extremists have bombed abortion clinics. Many of the far-right, white supremacist ideologies are based in perverted views of Christianity. The more recent QAnon movement is based around a Christian fundamentalist belief that Donald Trump is a savior sent from God to fight against satanic pedophiles. This illustrates the point that although we mostly focus on Islam in terms of religious terrorism today, it is certainly not exclusive to this one religion. We just happen to be at a point in time over the last half century or so when Islam has been going through its biggest challenges dealing with those committing violence in the name of the religion. With the rise of white nationalism, time will tell whether this calculus about religious terrorism changes. That said, we'll concentrate here on modern Islamic Jihadist terrorism. The most well-known and consequential example is Al Qaeda. Although our focus is on the U.S. context, we need to know how Al Qaeda originated to understand why they so badly wanted to target the U.S. Modern Islamic extremism grew in the 20th century as various political phases in the Arab world had a significant influence on activism among Arab nationalists and intellectuals. In the first half of the 20th century, there was largely turmoil in the Middle East. With the fall of the Ottoman Empire after World War I and the end of European domination after World War II, there was political unrest as numerous interests attempted to take control and many coups took place. Much of this unrest centers around conflicts between two opposing sectors of Islam, Sunni and Shia. A full breakdown of the differences is beyond the scope of this course, but it could be compared in some ways to the Catholic-Protestant divide referenced earlier, and the violence between them as part of the 30 Years' War in the 16th century. The 1979 war in Afghanistan was largely a standoff between Sunni Muslim groups and the Afghanistan government, who was mostly Shia. The government was viewed by these Sunni Muslims as not true Muslims, and as communists, because they were backed by the Soviet Union. Sunni groups, who were then backed by the U.S., Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, were also known as the Mujahideen, which translates to the volunteers in English. In the late 1970s and 1980s, the relationship between the U.S. and the Soviet Union was ice cold. So this is one reason the U.S. was supporting the Mujahideen, who were fighting the Soviet-backed Afghanistan government. The U.S. actually sent billions to the Sunni Mujahideen to fund their war effort as a proxy war against the Soviet Union. So in this way, the U.S. government was funding what would eventually splinter off to become Al Qaeda, led by 9/11 mastermind Osama bin Laden. After the Soviet war ended with the U.S.-backed Mujahideen victorious against the Soviet-backed Afghanistan government, bin Laden and his mentor, Abdullah Azzam, a Palestinian Sunni Muslim and Islamic scholar and theologian, often referred to as the father of global jihad, decided to continue their movement. Azzam and bin Laden worked together to author what became known as Al Qaeda, which in English means the base. Azzam and bin Laden didn't always see eye to eye, as they came to disagree on where to direct their movement. Azzam wanted to focus on local concerns at the Israeli and Palestinian front and turning Afghanistan into an Islamist government, while bin Laden wanted to wage a more global movement and spread his fundamentalist alternative vision of Islam to the entire world. In 1989, Abdullah Azzam, along with his children, was killed by a car bomb, with many speculating bin Laden was responsible. At that point, bin Laden took control of the movement and began directing it toward his more global ambitions. So this is a good point to take a step back and look at just what does Al Qaeda believe and what do they want to achieve. Essentially, Al Qaeda desires to unite the Muslim community worldwide into a single political and religious entity. This is their overarching goal. They believe that global jihad, or taking up the fight against the perceived enemies of Islam, is the only way to establish Sharia or Islamic law, that the re-establishment of Sharia law, or law on civil, criminal, moral, and everyday matters, is necessary to restore true Islamic states without capitalist or socialist influences. They believe that it is their duty and God's will to kill those who are against Islam. This is a non-negotiable part of their ideology. They must kill infidels or non-Muslims wherever they are across the globe. They are anti-West and anti-American specifically, seeing the U.S. as an oppressive force interfering with Muslim affairs. They believe the U.S. and Israel represent a conspiracy of Christians and Jews who are a threat to Muslims. While they support oppressed Muslims across the globe, they are also anti-apostate. In other words, against those who have renounced or otherwise left the Muslim faith, seeing this as an act of treachery punishable by death. Now, getting back to our timeline, in the early 1990s, Iraq invaded the country of Kuwait, which is located between Iraq and Saudi Arabia. The U.S. joined in the fight against Iraq and their leader, Saddam Hussein, to assist Kuwait. U.S. troops deployed to Saudi Arabia and a coalition was built at that time. Bin Laden, now the leader of a global jihadist movement, was furious because he thought the U.S. was actually there to take Saudi Arabia's resources, and humiliated that who he believed to be infidel or non-Muslim troops were on Kuwaiti soil, the location of some of Islam's holiest sites, including Medina and Mecca. In particular, he was angry at the Saudi royal family for being friendly with who he saw as the infidels or unfaithful from America. Bin Laden also felt humiliated that the Saudi royal family would rather bring in the U.S. than his volunteer force, and he became strongly interested in getting rid of what he saw as corrupt Muslim leaders. And at that point, America became Bin Laden's #1 enemy. Throughout the 1990s, Al Qaeda's support and strength grew to have a presence in some form throughout the Middle East. In 1991, bin Laden was forced by the Saudi Arabian government to leave his home country due to his extremist activities and repeatedly criticizing their U.S. alliance, and he headed to Sudan, whose leaders held similar ideologies. At the same time, he kept Al Qaeda's training camp stationed in Afghanistan. This would become important later. Sudan let him organize Al Qaeda, provided he helped build roads there. Bin Laden came from a very wealthy family and received donations from like-minded sympathizers from around the world. Sudan even gave false passports to bin Laden's associates so they can move around the world training would-be jihadists while also building networks with other militant Islamic groups in the area. Support grew for Al-Qaeda as radical theologians and wealthy Saudi businessmen supported bin Laden's efforts. Opposition, though, also grew at the same time, as authorities in the Middle East grew increasingly concerned over Al-Qaeda's activities. In part from pressure by the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, bin Laden and his associates were forced out of Sudan in 1996 and headed back to Afghanistan, where he joined forces with the Taliban, who controlled the area. Afghanistan provided rugged terrain and a code of honor in the communities that would assure his safety. Bin Laden felt empowered in Afghanistan to declare a fatwa, or ruling under Islamic law, outlining a declaration of war against the Americans occupying the land of the two holy places, or mosques depending on the translation, referring to Medina and Mecca in Saudi Arabia. During this time, Al-Qaeda carried out a number of attacks around the world, including in the U.S. and against key targets symbolizing U.S. strength and ideals, in much the same way that Al-Qaeda believed the U.S. was disrespecting Muslim holy lands in the Middle East. One attack was the August 1998 simultaneous bombings of 2 U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. 224 people were killed, 12 Americans among them, and more than 4,500 others were injured. This massive attack brought Al-Qaeda to public attention in the U.S. for the first time, and resulted in bin Laden being placed on the FBI's list of 10 most wanted fugitives. Another was the October 2000 suicide bombing of Navy destroyer USS Cole in Yemen that resulted in the deaths of 17 sailors and 37 others injured. And then there was the bombing of the World Trade Center that happened a few years earlier in February 1993, which is often forgotten due to being overshadowed by what happened later. A van filled with explosives went off in the parking garage below the North Tower, which left a 100-foot crater and took out several stories of the building, but did not critically damage it beyond repair. 6 people were killed and over 1,000 others were injured. Their goal was to take down one of the towers and crash it into the second to eliminate both. The terrorists responsible were planning other attacks as well, but were captured before they could carry them out. One of them was Ramzi Youssef, who had spent time in Al Qaeda training camp in Afghanistan and was the nephew of Al Qaeda leader Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. While it's believed Youssef was the driving force behind the bombing, it was later found that he received funding and advice from Mohammed. Mohammed would later mastermind another plot involving the hijacking of commercial airliners to use as weapons against U.S. targets. This, of course, led to the terrorist attacks against America on September 11, 2001. Al-Qaeda terrorists hijacked 4 airplanes, crashed 2 into the twin World Trade Center towers in New York City, and 1 into the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. A 4th hijacked airplane was headed for the U.S. Capitol building, but crashed into a field in Pennsylvania after the passengers bravely attempted to retake the plane. The 9/11 terrorist attacks claimed nearly 3,000 lives and injured more than 6,000 others, with thousands of additional deaths since then being attributed to illnesses related to the attacks, such as the toxic dust from the collapsing towers. After 9/11, bin Laden became the #1 most wanted terrorist in the world. He evaded capture for nearly a decade until finally being killed by a team of U.S. Navy SEALs in a night raid on an Al-Qaeda compound in Pakistan in May 2011. The 9/11 terrorist attacks remain by far the worst terrorist attack in U.S. history. As I mentioned before, but it bears repeating, it is an outlier that certainly does not represent a typical terrorist attack. More than 10 times as many people died on 9/11 than in any other terrorist attack against or in the U.S. before or since. The death toll was so massive it was left out of the FBI's Uniform Crime Report, as it would completely skew the statistics compared to all other crimes committed that year. It remains in a class unto itself in terms of its scale and impact, and hopefully we will never see anything like it again. As for Al Qaeda's threat to the U.S. since 9/11, the main Al Qaeda terrorist organization located in Afghanistan, known also as Al Qaeda Central, has been linked to several failed and foiled plots involving operatives in the U.S. who received training from them in the years following 9/11. These plots primarily occurred in New York, Virginia, Connecticut, and North Carolina, where multiple arrests were made. Then there is Al Qaeda located in the Arabian Peninsula in Yemen. This group is considered by many to be the most significant direct threat against the U.S. They've provided training and guidance to several individuals who carried out or attempted to carry out acts of violence in the U.S. They were linked to several notable incidents, including what has now become known as the underwear bomber, who tried to blow up an airplane as it was landing in Detroit, Michigan on Christmas Day in 2009, and a U.S. Army major who killed 13 soldiers at the Fort Hood, Texas Army base the same year. Though inspired by, but not directly linked to, a specific group, the brothers who carried out the Boston Marathon bombing in April 2013 learned about how to make their pressure cooker bombers from online AQAP magazine Inspire. And there were numerous other failed and foiled plots linked to AQAP as well. Then there is Al Qaeda in Iraq. The original goal of this group that was formed around 2003 was to target coalition forces in the Iraq War and those supporting them. The most recent manifestation of the group became what we now know as the so-called Islamic State, ISIS or ISIL, which stand for the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria and the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, respectively. It has also been referred to by the Arabic acronym Daesh. ISIL is a Sunni militant group led originally by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who broke ranks with al-Qaeda and spread its membership from Iraq into Syria. The group was able to recruit some old members from a series of Iraqi prison breaks, and they were able to gain significant momentum after the withdrawal of coalition forces from Iraq in December 2011, which left a power vacuum they were able to exploit. By 2014, ISIL had claimed a massive amount of territory in Iraq and Syria and became the de facto governing force in those territories for several years, declaring themselves a caliphate with authority over all Muslims around the world. Even though they have lost control of most of these territories over the last few years, they still control significant portions of Iraq and Syria. Although then President Trump in late 2018 declared the U.S. had defeated ISIL in Syria, the U.S. Department of Defense had said around the same time there were still up to 30,000 ISIL members in the region, and 4 Americans were killed in an ISIL attack in Syria in early 2019. The sudden decision by President Trump in October 2019 to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria resulted in the escape of more than 700 people with suspected ties to ISIL from military detention camps after Kurdish forces fled to avoid the advance of Turkish troops. This was followed by the death of ISIL leader al-Baghdadi later that same month. The long-term implications of these consequential events, all occurring in such a short time, remain to be seen. So, what is the threat of ISIL in the U.S.? So far, ISIL has not managed to direct an attack inside the U.S., and its territorial losses in the last few years make it increasingly unlikely it will be able to do so in the near future. However, this does not mean they do not pose a threat. ISIL has inspired numerous Americans to conduct jihadist attacks in the U.S., and many more have put plots into motion but were stopped before they could carry them out. Still others have provided material and monetary support for ISIL, including resources, attempting to travel to Iraq and Syria to join ISIL, and helping with recruitment and training. More than half of the deadly jihadist attacks in the U.S. since 9/11 were inspired by ISIL in some way. The deadliest were the December 2015 mass shootings at a health department Christmas party in San Bernardino, California, and the June 2016 mass shooting inside the LGBT Pulse nightclub in Orlando, Florida. 14 people were killed in San Bernardino, and 49 people were killed in Orlando. The Orlando shooting was the deadliest mass shooting in U.S. history at the time, until the shootings outside a music festival in Las Vegas the following year, where 60 people lost their lives. To conclude, what is the threat posed by Islamic Jihadist extremism in the U.S. more broadly? While the threat still exists, it is not nearly as great as it once was, for the moment anyway. Counterterrorism reports show the number of Al Qaeda and ISIL members and attacks have been declining worldwide over the past few years. Only 3 deaths in the U.S. have been linked to Islamic Jihadists since 2017, all tied to a single shooting incident at the Naval Air Station in Pensacola, Florida, by an AQAP-linked terrorist who was a Saudi Arabia military officer in the U.S. as part of a joint training program. A possible 4th homicide committed by a neo-Nazi convert to Islam in 2018. Despite this decline, the threat of ISIL-inspired attacks being committed by Americans in the U.S. remains concerning. Like Al-Qaeda, ISIL has largely become a symbol for those sympathetic to its ideology to follow as religious extremist propaganda continues to spread around the world. And it's hard to predict what will happen in the future or where the next attack may originate. It's possible that after nearly 30 years of continuous threat from Islamic jihadists, the threat to the U.S. has finally run its course. But if history is any guide, there is likely more to come. What form it will take and how much of a threat it will continue to be going forward remains to be seen. Well, that's all for now. Have a good one.